I want to first acknowledge that I'm standing on stolen Nonotuck land and acknowledge the history of colonialism and the genocide of Indigenous peoples that brings me to this land today. I would also like to thank very much Omar and Leslie for inviting me to be a part of this very venerable lecture series. I don't feel I should even be in it, but I'm happy to be here. This is a rescheduled talk from last year, and everyone had to do so much work to make these things happen. It just feels very, very powerful to me how much work everyone is doing right now. And so somehow capitalism has made it, found a way to make us even busier during this time of intense isolation, and people are exhausted, students are exhausted. So I wanted to thank also the students who are here for being here, and to everyone who showed up. Thank you. Thank you for making the time. Yeah, you know what? No more disclaimers. I'm just going to start with this talk. It is called Metabolics of the Book. And one thing I do need to say at the outset is that I realized that this is actually a two-part talk, and most of the claims that I meant to make, I have to make in a second half. This talk today is really going to be like preparation for the second half of the talk. So let me begin. One of the things we know is that there is an avenue into revolution that proceeds through transness. Certainly the strongest and most utopian version of this claim was made in the uprisings this summer when Angela Davis now famously said, "The trans community taught us that it is possible to effectively challenge that which is considered the very foundation of our sense of normalcy. So if it is possible to challenge the gender binary, then we can certainly effectively resist prisons and jails and police." The path to revolution that Davis is describing is not illuminated by transness. That would be to repeat an error that Emma Heaney has exposed, the exploitation of the trans feminine as an allegory for the modernity of cis subjectivity. Rather, the path to revolutionary vision is cleared by transness, not as a figural, but as a dialectical relation that is materially lived. Just as gender structures the prison system, as Davis argued some time ago, so does transgender life represent a necessary, though surely not sufficient, condition for the work of abolition. Davis's argument has to do with the praxis and reproductive labor of Black trans life and the trans feminine, and her claims need no further rhetorical exposition from me, though I feel lucky to have heard them. I'm making a different and while not unrelated argument. It is, I'm sorry to say, less utopian and more Marxological. What I want to say today is that some of how we understand Marx has to do with how we also have come to understand sex, gender, and transsexuality. In other words, there is a path to Marx that proceeds through transness. More specifically, and this is the unsupportable claim that I need to make in part two, but more specifically, much of the contemporary reception of Marx, in particular, the ever more popular strain of eco-socialist Marx that ranges around his concept of metabolic rift that I'll discuss in a bit, proceeds through transness. This path, however, is thorny, and when we try to describe it, it vanishes, even for those who have lived it. So what I'm going to do here is more exploratory than diagnostic around the relationship of transness and some key concepts in Marx, and it's very preliminary. In fact, I have to come to terms with the fact that I'm only really going to be able to present the first half of a two-part argument today. Part of the reason for this is that I did not expect to be spending as much time with Leslie Feinberg's Stone Butch Blues as I'm about to do here, but I started working with it and it ended up sucking me in a way that I didn't expect. So the way this talk is going to go is that I'll begin with an initial section where Stone Butch Blues kind of introduces us to some of the questions I'm trying to ask. Then I'll pan out into a broader view of post-war literature and a Marxist literary hermeneutic, and then circle around to some work in trans studies, well, to bookmarking some work in trans studies that I think will helpfully complicate these hermeneutics, but I won't have time to extrapolate that work, which is really what I meant to do. So here, I think we need to think of this talk as setting up the problem. In the afterword to the 10th anniversary edition of Stone Butch Blues, a book which tracks the Bildung and political development of a character named Jess Goldberg, the author named Jess Goldberg. The author and activist Leslie Feinberg says Z is encountering the book 10 years after publication, but quote, for the first time. Now, it is true, I think, that an author can never experience their own book as a reader, but this must be an especially strange experience when the book is what Feinberg has described as, quote, very thinly veiled autobiography. Of her autobiography, then, Feinberg is just a reader disoriented by the very path Z has carved. Quote, by the time I held the book in my hands, the inked words seemed like faint animal tracks on a smooth landscape, a cold trail I couldn't follow, end quote. I hadn't read Stone Butch Blues since the first edition came out while I was in college, and I had never read the afterword. Finding myself returned to the book for this talk, I did not expect it to read with this new paratextual apparatus, something like a cold case file, an untraceable trail in equal parts haptic and noirish, registering uncannily the function Frederick Jameson ascribes to detective fiction, connecting seemingly disparate aspects of the social world through the libidinal attention of a detective character who serves as a, quote, and this is Jameson, organ of perception, a membrane which, irritated, serves to indicate in its sensitivity the nature of the world around it, end quote. Perhaps it is ironic for Stone Butchness to serve as such a sensitive organ, but then again, anyone who has met a Stone Butch might object, perhaps it is not. In any case, was there any other way that Feinberg's novel / thinly veiled autobiography could have begun than with an epistolary moan to a former lover, written from within the cold, anti-heroic night of her absence? Teresa, Jess's once co-worker at a cannery, union comrade, partner, and communist, is the addressee of Stone Butch Blues, current whereabouts and occupation unknown. Quote, for more than 20 years, I've lived on this lonely shore, says Jess on the infamous first page, wondering what became of you. Are you turning tricks today? Are you waiting tables or learning Word Perfect 5.1? End quote. The catalog of service work periodizes the moment of the text's writing across a chasm of love lost and industrialization offshored, from a present unknowable neoliberal landscape across which a collection of possible Teresas transit. The litany of rhetorically interchangeable jobs, turning tricks, waiting tables, learning Word Perfect 5.1, anticipates what Jules Gleason and Elle O'Rourke, in their introduction to the forthcoming volume on transgender Marxism, historicize as the period in which, quote, the supposed sureties of Fordist employment have been superseded by casualization and the growing demand for the feminized skills of caring and service labor. On the one hand, the casualization of labor has made it less likely that any given trans person will require a singular professional persona to last their whole working lifetime. On the other, this same process also guts the institutions which might previously have been called upon to offer some semblance of protection from employer prejudices, end quote. Much of the first half of Stone Butch Blues is about the labor of securing these protections, love, community, and especially a union job. Perhaps the apex of this quest unfolds, or at least it does for me, in one of the most gripping renderings of softball I have ever read, an incredibly detailed and embodied game played between union butches and union cis men for the practically Hegelian stakes of mutual recognition. But Stone Butch Blues begins in the après-coup of all of this, the vertiginous aftermath of deindustrialization, where everything has been lost to anomie, urban dating, and the ongoing primitive accumulation that separates workers from union jobs, freeing them into a roster of service work. 1993, when Stone Butch Blues was originally published, was the beginning of a trajectory since which, as Annie McClanahan has charted, quote, nearly half of job growth in the US has been in low-paid service work, and as of 2016, the combination of retail, leisure, hospitality, and personal service makes up about 23% of all employment, end quote. Though many, if not most scholars who work on this shift will begin their analyses somewhere between the 1970s and the 1990s, McClanahan takes a much longer view of what she presents as the generalization of a racialized hierarchy of tipped versus wage work that extends for her a plantation logic through the 20th and 21st centuries. Quote, one of the leading proponents of tip wages in the early 20th century, argues McClanahan, was the Pullman Corporation, which exclusively hired Black men from the South because, in the words of one executive, and then she quotes this executive, but I'm just going to redact what he says, that they've exclusively hired Black men from the South because of essentially a purported comportmental proclivity to people pleasing. The characterological, essentially eugenist basis of service work, from McClanahan, quote, registers the sense that there was a deep connection between the non-waged work of in-person service and the non-waged work of chattel slavery, end quote. The 20th century twist of all of this was that Pullman figured out how to make customers complicit in its scheme. As a St. Louis Republic editorial in 1915 reads, quote, other corporations before now have underpaid their employees, but it remained for the Pullman Corporation to discover how to induce the public to make up by gratuities for its failure to pay its employees a living wage, end quote. This practice of relying on customers to make up for the absence of a living wage, says McClanahan, quote, was legalized and codified by the 1966 FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act amendment. The setting of a sub-minimum wage for the restaurant and hospitality sector was a massive labor cost subsidy for the restaurant, hotel, and leisure industry, one that arguably contributed to the transformation of the US economy from a manufacturing to a service economy, end quote. So essentially, she's wanting to do this longue durée analysis of service work that begins with a kind of plantation logic and then moves to a kind of post-Reconstruction Jim Crow South moment in which the racialized hierarchization of labor is what kind of prepares for a later generalization of service work now to be such a massive proportion of the US economy. Stone Butch Blues does not itself articulate this long view of the rise of the service industry, nor, as several critics have pointed out, does it account for the ways in which it itself relies on Black and Indigenous figures to teach Jess something either about race politics or, as Mark Rifkin has pointed out, about accepting her own gender nonconformativity. This kind of Black and Indigenous reproductive labor is both figured in the book as central to Jess's development and then figuratively elided by the book in the event of Jess's breakup, which becomes, we could say, the emotional hegemon that organizes the narration of history thereafter, such that ultimately the transformation of the labor landscape from a post-war world of union jobs to a chaos of gig work is figured as an apostrophic address from a butch to a femme. This is the infamous letter to Teresa with which the book begins. The schism of history is embedded in a schism between lovers, one that is violently introduced in the diegesis of the book by Jess's ambivalently, but ultimately realized and then unrealized desire to take exogenous hormones toward a more phenotypically organized trans identity. Quote, Teresa sighed, I'm a femme, Jess, I want to be with a butch. And I'm starting to feel like part of the women's movement, even though I can't be all the parts of who I am at the same time. My world's expanding. Great, I snorted, mine's shrinking. But the hormones are like the looking glass for me. If I pass through it, my world could open up too. Teresa shook her head. I don't want to be with a man, Jess. I won't do it, end quote. A certain kind of medicalized transness produces the rift that lands Jess on, quote, this lonely shore. Around this romantic shattering, all of history has rippled out. In other words, the catacresis between the rift caused by medicalized transness and the historical rift of deindustrialization is the inverted form of appearance of the book's real historical context, in which the racialized hierarchy of labor, both in terms of the caring labor of indigeneity and the historical context of plantation labor and post-Reconstruction Jim Crow, feeds into the 20th century explosion of service work, which leaves Jess wondering where and at what occupation Teresa is now. But Stone Butch Blues is not a work of historical scholarship, and I'm not saying it ought to have been able to produce a more historically nuanced account necessarily, but I am interested in how the narrative trope of the breakup both figures and then elides a question about politics. Jess's lament to Teresa in her absence bears some similarity both in its non-specificity and its sentimentality to the trope of poetic apostrophe, or as Jonathan Culler famously had it, the embarrassment of address. In addition to being an embarrassment, however, or perhaps because of it, apostrophe, as the critic Anahid Nersessian has recently argued, creates the common ground of an artificial space. It summons, and she's looking to the art critic Rosalind Krauss on this, a quote, phenomenological vector between subject and world. Lyric poetry and detective stories then share a function, if not a form, obsessive melancholy that is ultimately less about solving the mystery of a lost object than evoking a set of affects around it. I had coffee in Greenwich Village earlier with a woman, Jess continues, this is still on the first page, confessing the details of a bad date, plinking a pebble into the well of Teresa-lessness. A mutual friend fixed us up since we're both into politics. Well, we sat in a coffee shop and she talked about democratic politics and seminars and photography and problems with her co-op and how she's so opposed to rent control. Small wonder, daddy is a real estate developer, end quote. The expanse between an erstwhile communist partnership and the pathetic and tragic equation of politics to the Democratic Party yawns wide. How is it that Jess has gone from dating a comrade and coworker and sharing a political horizon to dating the daughter of a real estate developer? Hashtag relatable content. Anyway, this is like the dystopian verso side of interclass contact that Samuel Delany writes a paean to in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which is another lament about gentrification. But one of the things Delany's book laments is that the closing of the Times Square porn theaters closed down spaces where people of different classes had contact. In Feinberg's world, and I really appreciate this, class contact is a horror story in which gentrification has prized open a portal through which a working class butch might find themselves on a terrible date with the daughter of a developer. Let us remember that Feinberg's last reported words were, "Remember me as a revolutionary communist." Maybe the apostrophic yearning for a lost object is not just Jess's, but the book's, and the object is not Teresa, but politics. If we hadn't already read Stone Butch Blues as autofiction, and many readers do, including Juliet Jakes, who recently kind of limbed the contours of the is it autofiction or is it not around Stone Butch Blues by saying, on the one hand, it's not quite autofiction as it doesn't use Feinberg's own name, but nonetheless ends up blurring the boundaries between Feinberg's life and fiction. If we haven't already read Stone Butch Blues as autofiction, we will, I think, when we read the afterword. Quote, I am typing these words as June 2003 surges with pride, says Feinberg. What year is it now as you read? Feinberg asks, and we know that Z wrote this afterward after a lengthy court battle to resecure the copyright for the novel after Allison Press, the original publisher, declared bankruptcy. Having won, Feinberg makes the book available for free on her website, as it still is today, where you can read it as a sort of Teresa yourself. Like Teresa, we are asked, where are you and what are you doing? Quote, what has been won? What has been lost? I can't see from here. Feinberg continues in the afterword. We know that Z was ill and dying as Z wrote these words, and they strike with an enormity more than uncanniness when we read them now. The apostrophe is slipping here. Not only where are we, but also when we read this in 2020, where is the here from which Feinberg is speaking and from which Z cannot see as it recedes perspectively into the distance? It is hard not to read this afterword as an aleatory apostrophe from Feinberg to Feinberg herself, a noirish, meta, and autofictional supplement to the body text. In his truly wonderful book, Contemporary Drift, the critic Theodore Martin spends some time with what he calls the acousmatic and non-diegetic quality of noir voiceover. Quote, To listen to voiceover is to be haunted by the often unanswerable question of where the voice that's talking to us is talking to us from. Because they aren't located in the diegesis of the films, they have no source for us to discover. This is the case exemplarily with Sunset Boulevard. And actually, Omar is gonna screen just like a 1-minute clip of Sunset Boulevard so you get a sense of this. Omar, thank you very much for doing this.
Yes, this is Sunset Boulevard, Los Angeles, California. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning. That's the homicide squad, complete with detectives and newspapermen. A murder has been reported from one of those great big houses in the 10,000 block. You'll read about it in the late editions, I'm sure. You'll get it over your radio and see it on television. Because an old-time star is involved. One of the biggest. But before you hear it all distorted and blown out of proportion, before those Hollywood columnists get their hands on it, maybe you'd like to hear the facts, the whole truth. If so, you've come to the right party. You see, the body of a young man was found floating in the pool of her mansion, with 2 shots in his back and 1 in his stomach. Nobody important, really. Just a movie writer with a couple of B pictures to his credit. The poor dope. He always wanted a pool. Well, in the end, he got himself a pool. Only the price turned out to be a little high.
Sunset Boulevard is what Martin is using as an example of this voiceover that comes from outside of the diegesis of the text itself. And it's spoken from beyond the grave. The voice that's speaking is Gillies, who you get that shot is lying in the water. Sunset Boulevard begins in the gutter. Then we float backwards down the broad street, the camera's nose so close to the ground that the asphalt becomes a galaxy, a slash of deep space studded with light. The camera slows, peaks up. At the far end of the road, headlights owl into shape. The police are mowing us down, and now the voiceover begins. The house of a movie legend, a scandal of death. These famous opening shots, Gillies face down in the pool, and we're beneath the scene, looking up at Gillies' dead eyes, unseeing us. Then through the glassy surface at the cops and the paparazzi, camera flashes like solar flares. The galaxy is above us now, and we're being buried at the bottom of a pool, while the dead narrator lives on in voiceover above us from beyond the grave. Noir voiceover in general stages a paradox. A neutral tone, clinical and precise about location, often retraces steps to show the way things have proceeded inexorably to their fatal conclusion. But the acousmatic and non-diegetic fact of voiceover showcases the asynchronicity of picture and sound. The media that make up the genre are coming from different locations. In this way, the voiceover's placelessness, and this is a quote from Martin, points to here and now of the speaking subject. It describes and circumscribes how an individual is situated in social space by depicting the institutional forces that have compelled him to speak in the first place. Registering the call of the acousmatic voice, the noir voiceover points us to its underlying source, which turns out to be its overarching social situation, end quote. Reading Feinberg's Afterward, in a way, marshals the conventions of noir voiceover in order to dramatize her situation, a situation of utopian de-alienation of a cultural worker from her labor. This alienation, this contraction of alienation, the alienation has contracted into what is projected as an unmediated intimacy between author and reader that exceeds both commodity form and death of the author. The afterword makes palpable the event of having regained the rights to the work through its apostrophic address, now not to Teresa, though echoing that earlier diegetic address, but to the vastness and absolute contingency of audience once copyright has been lifted. The Noir voiceover, Martin argues, points ultimately to the situation, the context of the speaker. In the case of Feinberg's paratextual afterword, the dramatizing of an escape from corporate ownership and the positing of manuscript as gift to incalculable readers becomes an opening of history itself to the absolute contingency of situation. What year is it now as you read, Feinberg asks. What has been won I can't see from here. End quote. The unknowable here from which Feinberg is speaking becomes the unknowable constellation of situations with all their political opportunities from which Z is read. The generalization of address is the realization of Apostrophe's most utopian modality as, again, Narcissian, the common ground of an artificial space, a phenomenological vector that finally voices, or perhaps voiceovers, the real question of situation, which is the question of politics. Not politics as the Democratic Party, but politics as the openness of history and the abolition of alienation, a horizon resolved not in the diegesis of the book, but in its paratext. Not politics as a platform, but politics as the enjambment of temporal markers, what year is it now, with the material question of how we live that year, what has been won. Not politics in stages, but as the utter contingency of a heterogeneity of readers with all our wins and losses. So I think there's, for lack of a better word here, a utopian and a dystopian version of what Feinberg is doing and of what transness, or a version of transness as injecting exogenous hormones, is doing in this book. Transness as injecting exogenous hormones is the narrative hinge, the precipitating cataclysm that generates the temporal and spatial chasm across which deindustrialization and the rise of service work unfolds. Transness in the dystopian sense, thus, becomes a narrative fixation that occludes its own real historical context. At the same time, the chasm created by the event of medicalized transness furnishes the landscape for an apostrophe to the political, an opportunity for exhortative speech, an agitprop-esque moment in the text, which I do appreciate, this conjuring of a space into which the question of the necessity and the contingency into a situation, the contingency of intervening into a situation can be asked. For me, as a literary historian, the question is to ask how the self-reflexivity of transness becomes a vehicle through which both utopian and dystopian modalities gets actualized. The vexations of trans-memoir and trans-reflexivity, self-reflexivity, of course, is both a live and an old question, a seemingly ineradicable issue that has dogged trans authors and scholars for a very long time. The critic Vivian Namaste some time ago generated the highly quotable objection that autobiography is the only genre in which transgender people would be permitted to speak. In other words, we are allowed only to write creatively when we are testing to the authenticity of our own subjectivity. The tacit enforcement of this norm by publishers has produced a host of really wonderful détournements from queer and trans authors playing with and against this genre restriction, often leading towards autofictional wink. Kai Cheng Tom, Mackenzie Wark, T. Clutch Fleischman, Renee Gladman, to name a few. The prevalence of reflexivity as a literary modality extends, of course, beyond trans writing. Indeed, it could be said to be one of the central ways in which post-war US literature has been periodized, in large part due to Mark McGurl's field-defining program era, which centralizes autofiction in the periodization of post-war and contemporary literature more broadly. In recognition of the fundamental importance of self-reference, he says, I will call the act of authorship in the program era the autopoetic process, and here designate as two of its most basic interacting elements the values of creativity and experience and the act of authorship that it records, end quote. For McGurl, the aesthetic etiology of self-management is the intensification of modernist reflexivity. This self-reflexivity, via the institution of the creative writing program, becomes what McGurl sees as a generalized or dominant mode of creative expression. Quote, the metafictional impulse in post-war writing suggests that literary practices might partake in a larger, multivalent social dynamic of self-observation. This would extend from I'm still quoting McGurl, from the self-observation of society as a whole in the social sciences, media, and arts, to the reflexive accumulation of corporations, which pay more and more attention to their own management practices and organizational structures, down to the self-monitoring of individuals who understand themselves to be living not lives simply, but life stories of which they are the protagonists, end quote. Compulsive self-performance is the literary expression of what McGurl describes as the information economy, which doesn't consume experience directly, but rather the product of transformative labor that is conducted upon experience. There's more to say about McGurl, but in the interest of time, I'll just insert here that I differ from his account of the relative weight of reflexivity in describing the dynamics of late capitalism, which I believe is not fully explained by entrepreneurialism or self-reflexivity, but more by the question of what Marx called primitive accumulation, or David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, or Rosa Luxemburg calls extended accumulation, or what we have finally arrived at, which may be the simple truth, by way of thinkers such as Nikhil Singh, Jackie Wang, Sayak Valencia, and Denise de Silva, more directly as violence. The uneven distribution of violence, domestically and globally, as the ongoing condition of late capital's so-called self-management, whether it is through police violence as the valorization of the value of whiteness, that is Singh's argument, violence as the organizing rubric of the uneven development of debt, that's Wang, the subjection to violence and the affectability of the subject as the foundation of the racial hierarchization of persons, that's De Silva, or violence to the body as itself a commodity, as in Valencia. Self-management is the fiction that is produced by this violence. Self-management is the fiction capitalism tells about itself, and so I am not sure how much hermeneutic force we can derive from also claiming that this is the fiction that fiction tells. So what I am making then is a different point, and it has to do with the implications for a hermeneutic of Western literature if we understand violence as primary and constitutive rather than as exceptional. The question then is what becomes of the concepts of experience and creativity, not to mention self-referentiality, when our point of reference is not the information economy as such, but rather the uneven distribution of violence as the means by which value, informational or whatever, is valorized. On the question of fantasies of the self-regulation of aesthetic value, Alison Schunkweiler, the critic Alison Schunkweiler, has recently described a point of intersection between the explosion of memoir and what she calls neo-homesteaderism. Neo-homesteading is a mode that finds itself in relation to a long tradition of, quote, early 20th century back to the land models. In an era before Social Security, food stamps, or Medicaid, the goal of homesteading was not necessarily to preserve an artisanal way of life, but to achieve security, independence, and autonomy, end quote. After World War II, Schunkweiler says, liberals, quote, turned away from homesteading as a guarantee of security and instead concentrated on public spending programs and the development of a full employment economy, end quote. Now, the return of neo-homesteading today, which is kind of so obvious that you could fall over it if you step outside your home, or even if you don't, registers the instability of wage labor in the present and takes a variety of forms, from far-right petty bourgeois prepperism, focused on like commodities, prepping commodities, to liberal fetishes of artisanal, and ultimately, this is Schunkweiler, conservative ethics of production and producerism, end quote, to, and this is her again, new leftist peasantism, end quote, skeptical that, quote, the industrial or even the post-industrial working class is somehow going to deliver humanity from an abundant and egalitarian socialism, end quote. Noting the proliferation of memoirs about homesteading, this vortex of self-reliance, Schunkweiler argues, is about adapting to a changing white-collar and professional job economy, trying to combine waged work with unwaged producerism. This is her, including but not limited to selling memoirs, is fundamentally an effort to compensate for declining real wages and job security, the loss of the family wage, and all the other ways that post-Fordist flexibility defines conditions of employment. So she's kind of talking about this mise en abîme of essentially petty bourgeois self-reliance, where there's now an explosion of memoir about being self-reliant, and then the memoir itself is kind of part of this ethics of producerism. Now, I want to briefly mention, this is very anecdotal, an interview between Zadie Smith and Knausgaard, who wrote all those like auto-fictional books, of which I've only read about 50 pages, where she I think is kind of getting at something that Frederick Jameson has also gotten at around the attenuation of allegory as a literary mode of late. She gives this very, thoughtful interview. And then right at the end, she inserts kind of, I think in a surreptitious way, kind of an interesting critique, which I appreciated. She says kind of archly, and I won't do the British accent, but she says, and I'm paraphrasing, something like, "But do you think you'll ever really make art?" Which I love that she asked Knausgaard this question and that he had to answer it. But on the one hand, we can read this as a comment about contemporary autofiction as a kind of mise en surface, loops of cultivated self-reflexivity. But given Schunkweiler's account of memoir as the figural accompaniment to and product of neo-homesteading, and given what I am trying to say about the relationship between the violence of ongoing primitive accumulation as the underlying condition for the intensification of fictions of self-referentiality, I want to propose that we have to understand the attenuation of the allegorical, the giving way of allegory to self-referentiality as a certain post-war coming into prominence of the aesthetics anti-figural supplement, what Walter Benjamin might have called history's trash, as part of the aesthetic experience. That is to say that I see the autofictive impulse as a fantasy about closed loop metabolism, sort of like neo-homesteading, but less focused on producerism and more so on the question of waste or the residual and its reuptake. It may be more generative to think of this residuum as an eruption of what the art critic Jalal Mansour describes as battalion-based materialism, that material which resists metaphorical displacement. This anti-figuralness, I think, is the auto-fictional form itself, not so much a refusal or failure of art as a revaluation of abjection and surplus. The other name for abjected excess, of course, is the body, or what Jameson understands as the state of contemporary fiction, a reduction to the body, waves of generalized sensations burrowed into a perpetual present in which allegory has lost its stature and the haptic, the apostrophe, the phenomenological vector has taken its place. An interesting companion text to Schunkweiler's would be Phil Neal's Hinterland, which wages a many-genred effort, memoir, travel narrative, political economic treatise, manifesto, etc., itself a kind of autofiction, to delineate the post-industrial US as a landscape of intensifying hinterland, neither urban nor rural and not suburban either, rather zones of dispossession ranged around the maintenance of massive infrastructures for urban development, such as cloud storage zones, industrial farms, power generation sites, and logistics hubs. In the hinterland, Neal argues, forms of ultra-right self-reliant networks develop, bound by xenophobia and white supremacy. Neal's recommendation is for the proliferation, he's obviously an anarchist, of left and ultra-left similarly self-reliant networks as a form of resistance. To this, I will only say that if we're going to go this route, it would, not that it matters what I say, but in any case, it would be good if it were conducted with the leftist epidemiological ethos that Du Bois notes about John Brown this summer. I was reading for the first time Du Bois's biography of John Brown, and there's this amazing section that really struck me, especially at this moment, where Du Bois is describing, he so many times talks about John Brown being an amazing nurse. He's like obsessed with the idea of John Brown doing domestic labor. And I think that's interesting. And at one point, Brown's kids get sick with scarlet fever. And Du Bois quotes one of the daughters saying, when his children were ill, he took care of us himself. And if he saw persons coming to the house, he would go to the gate to meet them, not wishing them to come in for fear of spreading the disease, end quote. So this, to me this summer, this really struck me as amazing because it was kind of making clear the extent to which Brown, or at least in Du Bois's idea of Brown, understands that the white family is the pathogen, right? And in this moment where kind of like there's this very petty bourgeois anxiety around protecting your white family from the world, reading John Brown's orientation being about protecting the world from your white family, I thought was incredible. But I've gotten off topic. Or maybe not, because this question of the pathogenicness of the white family is not only critical to our current moment, but reconnects to the question of cultivation raised but not really answered by McGurl. Indeed, we still need to give an account of the aesthetics of self-cultivation, which, as it turns out, has everything to do with the pathology of the white family, and has historically received its most disturbing treatment in the colonial genre of travel narrative. So if you'll indulge a Benjaminian leap backwards to Richard Lygon's 1657 True and Exact History of Barbados, and this is a content warning that I will be quoting this racist travel narrative. In Lygon's history, the stakes of settler excrescens make an unmasked appearance as a truly hallucinatory fantasy about cultivation. In the course of typical colonialist description of the flora of the island, Lygon inserts a strange theatrical tangent in the form of an eavesdropped conversation. So he describes himself watching a planter, watching his daughter, and essentially in the scene, Lygon is describing this tree, and he says the tree holds a pulpy substance full of small seeds like a fig. The seeds have this property that when they've passed through the body, wheresoever they are laid down, they grow. So the idea is that where you defecate, you are planting. And Lygon is watching a planter watch his daughter defecate outside. And he says, a planter and eminent man in the island, seeing his daughter by chance about her natural business, called to her, plant even, daughter, plant even. She answered, if you do not like them, father, remove them, father, remove them. So he's saying to her shitting is essentially productive. That's the fantasy about the white family, right? What the Barbados document burps up from its baleful depths is cultivation as the fantasized capacity of settler bodies to repair the problems produced by settler bodies in their capacities as agents of primitive accumulation. I'm thinking here of the phenomenon known to Marxists, and here I'm kind of wrapping up because I was told to speak for 45 minutes and it's about to be 45 minutes. So I'm going to wrap up and then kind of bookmark the points that I wanted to make but wasn't able to get to. I'm thinking in particular here of the phenomenon known to Marxists as metabolic rift, or the increasing distance between the sites of consumption and sites of production, which results in the non-return of waste products to the site at which they're produced and the resulting impoverishment of the soil. So this is, in other words, once you get urbanization, you get the taking of commodities that are produced in the countryside into the city, but the waste products and the excrement are not returned to the fields as fertilizer. And this was starting to make people in the 18th and the 19th century, especially when Marx was writing, very anxious because Marx was reading a lot about soil science, and I can talk about that more in the question period. And he was learning that there were these theories that were beginning to develop in the period that were running against kind of what had been soil science orthodoxy. Soil science orthodoxy believed that soil could kind of endlessly replenish itself. But in particular, this one agricultural chemist, von Liebig, was putting forth this idea that actually there's a metabolic relationship between labor and the earth, and there's a metabolic relationship in the natural world that involves the reincorporation of waste products back into the site of the production of the things that had become waste. And so Metabolic rift is a crisis of cultivation. The poisonous tail end of the scorpion of primitive accumulation come back to lash the metropole in the face. I read the triply voyeuristic scene of the settler daughter's fecund excrescence in Ligon then as articulating with some unnerving exactitude the ideological kernel of this. The settler body is idealized as magically able to repair / fertilize / make productive the contradictions it itself produces. Primitive accumulation, the fact that historical conditions had to converge to set capitalism in motion, raises the specter of contingency. This collision of historical forces haunts capitalism as the threat of its dissolution. If capitalism was made to happen, it can be made to unhappen. And if metabolic rift has its way, it will unhappen as world apocalypse. To this threat, which even the bourgeoisie and the colonists in the 18th and 19th centuries knew was a problem that would come for them too, comes its answer in the fantasy of the perfect metabolicism of settler bodies, which I want to say themselves haunt autofiction's form, which is inextricable from its fantasy. The fantasy of not only the body, but also fiction's own perfect metabolicism. The imaginary resolution of the real social contradiction of primitive accumulation constitutes, I want to say, the prehistory of autofiction and the anti-aesthetic, which is insufficiently described as self-management and would be better understood as the longue durée of a violent reverie of the West, that of a settler body as the metabolic solution to the separations wrought by the body itself, a missile sent from the metropole. So I need to pause there, but I want to say a little something about what I didn't get to say, which is, so the second half of this paper, which turned out to be much longer than I meant it to be, is a review, again, of how Marx's work in soil science led him to really focus on metabolic rift as this key concept for capitalism, how he essentially describes metabolic rift as the character of capitalism, that it will inevitably produce over and over these separations between production and consumption sites, and thus crises. And for this reason, there's no reforming capitalism. It's sort of baked into its character to do this, and one needs to overthrow capitalism in order to reestablish what he describes as a rational metabolism between humans and nature. Engels describes this as the abolition of the distinction between town and country, and that's a whole other interesting issue that we could talk about in relation, especially I think to Niels Hinterland. We don't really have a split between town and country in the same way anymore. But in any case, this concept of metabolic rift has really exploded in the past several decades as a way of understanding Marx. And a lot of people, part of this has to do with the fact that the 1976 translation of Capital translates Marx's word, which in German is Stoffwechsel. I don't speak German, and someone had to tell me how to pronounce that. But in any case, translated this word as metabolism in the 70s for the first time. This word was translated many different ways in the prior translation of Capital from the 19th century. Once Stoffwechsel was translated as metabolism, scholars started to become very interested in this idea of metabolic rift, and especially as sort of like this Marxist eco-socialist framework for understanding our world. People have asked, why is it that metabolism, really didn't become an important Marxist concept until recently? And many answers have been given by, I guess I would just say, like Marxist bros. Answers such as, well, the notebooks in which he talks about metabolism weren't really translated to the same extent, or, English needed to catch up with the German, or, this and that. But what I think trans theory can really add to this conversation, and what really interests me, is the way in which the concept of metabolism is key in a lot of work in trans theory, and in particular, Jules Gill Peterson's really excellent recent book, Histories of the Transgender Child. In that book, Peterson is showing the way in which the concept of metabolism became key to articulating what we now understand as a sex-gender binary in the 1950s. And in very brief, and in a kind of like an unhelpful reduction of Peterson's argument, basically she argues that, takes a look at these archives from clinics in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins, and also the Harriet Home, I think it's called. Suddenly I can't find the note on the actual name of this clinic, but in any case, Harriet Lane Home, where they're doing research on congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is a metabolic condition that leads to forms of virilization of bodies that are assigned female at birth. And what they're realizing is that cortisone therapy to address this metabolic condition, which has other symptoms, in fact, I don't know that we could really even describe virilization as a symptom. It has other sort of salt losing and sometimes fatal effects. Cortisone therapy also affects phenotypic sex characteristics. In other words, there's no way to isolate sex from other workings of the body. And so what people are realizing in the 1950s is that sex is not binary, that sex is plastic, in Gil Peterson's words. Gil Peterson argues essentially that gender is at that point brought in to stabilize the plasticity of sex. So you get this tight weaving of these metabolic research centers with early transgender clinics. And they start to, in these transgender clinics where they're also working on intersex patients, they start to make the argument that sex is plastic, but gender is not. People have fixed ideas and cultural ideas that are fixed about what gender they are. And so what we use hormone replacement to do is to bring the plastic body into line with the fixity of gender, to bring the plasticity of sex into line with the fixity of gender. What I want to say then is that I think following work by Gil Peterson and others, what we have to understand is that from, say, the 1950s onward, we get a kind of universalization of the concept of metabolism, what Marx would call a concrete abstraction, as a way of understanding sex and gender more broadly. And I want to, and I'm sort of doing further work towards trying to make this argument then that changes in how Marxism functions and how this concept of metabolic rift comes to the foreground in Marx owes a debt to the ways that sex and gender have infused our understanding of the concept of metabolism itself, and that it's unthinkable in the way that it gets thought now without a kind of like broader understanding there. So the general argument then is that, trans studies is what we need to understand how contemporary work in Marxism is functioning. This is like a niche interest, but for those who have that niche interest, perhaps there's some interesting questions that are coming up here. I do not know. I think that I've been speaking for 45 minutes, if not more at this point, so I'm just gonna stop. Thank you very much.